Hello. I wanted to kick off this third installment of a lecture series at Bangor Design Conference, which we didn't record in 2019, but because I've had quite a few questions since, I kind of felt maybe I should just commit it to be on YouTube. And that'll also mean it's kind of fun because the questions live on in the comments. As much as the first one, I focused on a story that I did for BBC Big Life Fix, helping a young man who had lost the use of his hands, who wanted to operate a DSLR camera to create a legacy before James Dunn sadly passed away. The second one was focusing on another Big Life Fix story of helping a young boy who was blind be able to navigate a playground and play with his friends more easily. And this third one is something that I seem to have got into quite a bit lately, is around prosthetics. And so this was helping a young man, Kyle, who didn't have the full facility of his hand, able to sort of fill his dream of becoming a hairdresser, which, as you can appreciate, is quite a intricate and detailed thing to do with your hands. So how do you basically go on a journey of creating prototypes that would understand the problem, but then also refine the solution? So I wanted to give a bit of a sort of, behind the scenes on, not just what happened in the video, because you can obviously go watch those online, but also taking a bit of a detailed look at the process and working with prototyping. So in design and in life. So there we go. So I wanted to forgive me if you've seen a couple of these before, but you can appreciate I was recording it for new audiences and new graduates, undergraduates rather. And so a little bit about prototyping in my career. The main talk looking at prototyping prosthetics, and then you could say prototyping your career. So a little bit of an intro that I wanted to sort of emphasize that this is about your career, and each of these things are going to be different, but I hope I'm giving some things that are still tangible rather than just maxims that sound good on Twitter. So prototyping my career started off with all these different experiences, looking at it from the left, aeroacoustic and motor chassis design at Dyson, getting into the sort of heavyweight engineering things, but then also then evolving into the design and what was called new product innovation teams to do more experimental stuff and a whole bunch of patents and new things like that. My final year project was working with the NHS, and I think if I haven't said it in previous talks, forgive me for repeating myself, but the whole reason I went with the NHS was because I wanted to do a project that was something that I had never had any familiarity or experience with. So the surgical environment, and specifically anesthetics, was something that I thought at no point will I be resting on my laurels or my prior experience here. And I would really strongly urge that even if you definitely want to, I don't know, become the best guitar manufacturer in the world, that's all good. But if you do your final year project in something which you have no experience of, that learning curve is really something that your process will differentiate you hugely from people who've maybe taken an easy or familiar route. So, your final year, you might not think it's the time to live dangerously, but actually that really is the thing that's going to differentiate you. And if it's any sort of consolation, I was looking at doing a foldable plug where if you're used to the British standards, there's 3 little pins. I was looking at how they could fold in on themselves to become small. I kind of thought that was cute, something that, I was like, oh, maybe Muji would buy it. And I was also looking at a better way to transport vaccines over long distances in hot countries using, I was exploring things like hydrogen fuel cells and heat pumps and recovery systems and insulation. And I went through those 2 projects, scrapping them both before settling on this medical one. So technically, my final year project was basically running from about November round till about May. And usually it would have been September till May. So if you're stressing out thinking, oh my God, I got to commit to my final year project, I would always still be in favour of a project that you're really, really passionate about, because you just go so much faster than if you're doing something where there's always a nagging doubt in the back of your head that it's just not really that going to be that good. I think going beyond Christmas is probably a really bad choice. Just to be responsible there for tutors. I'm not encouraging procrastination, but I am encouraging choosing the right project that you are willing to put the grind into. So anyway, doing stuff in Norway, packaging design, chopping bits off trees to achieve that. Doing stuff at Lego, can't really talk about it as you can imagine, but funky technology was very much what I was having to look at and then work out whether that could be converted into products that were maybe intended to be 10 years out. So yeah, really can't talk about it for years and years to come. But nonetheless, I've always been really interested in the engineering and the detail as well as the strategic thinking. Lots of sort of messing around. New technology still continues to fascinate me, things like AR and how that works. I still think that's one of those interesting things where it's a bit solution looking for a problem. And dare I say it, I think the interesting things with those technologies, they usually start by playful thinking. Not necessarily always just the heavyweight industrial application. I also put in this one of the I've been doing ceramics in the past for about 6 years, and so I think it, should we say, dispels the myth that engineers are just all about the nuts and bolts and don't care about art. You may not feel that needed to be said, but certainly when I left, I felt that did. And then a bunch of stuff you can see here with Big Life Fix. And of course, I'll be revealing a new story here today. And of course, leading teams at Sugru, doing all sorts of fun things with other electronics people. I increasingly am not doing projects where I'm the sole person. It's very much collaborative. And again, just people who have known my website, Design Modeling, linked down here, playing around with cardboard quite a bit. So anyway, bit of a summary there. But I wanted to basically emphasize that the CV is very much a sort of true story, but emphasis on story. No one said you had to say everything and you can edit and play with the narrative. So this is my CV. I won't go through it in huge detail, but the point is I sort of wanted to sort of make a point of if you have no previous work experience, take a look at these ones here, which are ISDE, Erasmus and Bunak. They're one of the few things where you can essentially get some chops and experience under programs just for undergraduates that allow you then to go to a company and actually have experience. So by the time I'd interned at California, and I might add, I got paid really quite well. It was like $30 an hour, which was tremendous. And I was even allowed to work overtime on some projects when we needed it. And actually, I think it was a higher rate than I started at Dyson in the UK. So yeah, that's sometimes how it goes. But I would say really don't go with this myth that you have to work for free. There are really, really good companies like Spec Design out there that respect and put you through your paces. And indeed, you have to ask the question, if you're working for free, what sort of agenda is your work got? I was working on projects that were critical, that clients definitely wanted a good result in. And so that pressure, although intense at times, was exactly what I wanted. And so I love the fact that even though my mentors were there as a safety net, they very much put me through my paces with an expectation that it had to be really good. And really good doesn't mean perfect. It just means that good enough that they would then take it to that finishing level with the client. Excuse me. So yeah, I wanted to basically just point out some of the things that aren't always obvious, that I graduated actually as a chemist, didn't think it was any use at all, but ironically that helped me much later lead an R&D team for 3 years at Sugru, which, if you don't know, it is a moldable glue, and so a lot of that is chemical engineering, and we were running projects that were based in America and then shipping entirely new equipment over to the UK to take it from a sort of hand-packed product into an automated thing. So again, you don't always know what your sort of wobbly experiences of the past are going to bring. I'd also worked between being chemist and retraining in product design engineering. I'd worked as a butcher, statistician at a local council and a horticultural specialist. So again, I didn't necessarily put these into my CV in a sort of pride of place way that I do now. But I think whenever it comes up in conversations, and I kind of think it's always good to draw on diverse experiences. So it's a bit how you want to deploy these things. But probably being in the sort of butchery trade for a little while, I got shown how to use knives in a very safe way, that probably helped me actually teach people how to use scalpels in a safe way as well for my design modeling websites, which there's a link just down here. You're welcome to check out. So I'd also worked for Dyson for 2 years in engineering before progressing 2 years more into the design and new product innovation. And arguably the statistics side of it from the council, I was able to cope with better the engineering rigor having done that. And again, horticultural specialist, I've to this day not had a more maverick boss than when I did at a really unusual horticultural specialist in Cumbria. And I think that in some ways like set me up for the sort of everything from the startup atmosphere, being at Sugru when there was only probably about 20 something people and it growing to 100, and tech scouting at Lego, of course, working with big corporates, but also startups and trying to figure out how to merge some of those ideas and talent together. So it's also worth pointing out that sometimes you don't always know how these things are going to pan out. And I was assessed for dyslexia in my second degree when some things just really weren't making sense. Frankly, in fast Fourier transform, algebra was completely losing me. And it was always like the I, J, and the L that seemed to mess with me, and so that's what triggered a bit of a test. But as a result, I'd like to think I don't use it as a sort of a crutch or an excuse, but it did actually help me better understand myself, even down to sort of my relationships of realizing when I'm going to be less good, in a relationship, just being a bit forgetful or less likely to retain certain information, and putting some countermeasures in. So I'd say the statistics would say you've got a good chance if you're doing a creative or engineering course. So it's not unreasonable to sort of maybe take a look at that. So anyway, I also sort of ended up, whilst I was at Sugru, helping a friend who had actually done a workshop for in Berlin back in the day when they were doing an unusual app called How Do, which was fantastic. And she called me and said, look, we had someone drop out at Lego. Can you sort of get on a plane in under 48 hours and put on a presentation for the what was called then the Future Play Lab? And essentially one thing led to another, and a year and a half later I was working at Lego. So it was never by design, but sometimes doing those free gigs and just helping someone out is tremendously powerful. So I'd always recommend it. And as I said, working as a tech scout and direction designer at Lego was incredible. I got taken to all these different places, from Tokyo, Tel Aviv, Berlin, all these really exciting startups that we were trying to work with. And of course, just being immersed in many different sort of strategic processes to bring new and exciting things into the corporate environment and make products at obviously a huge global scale. Safe to say, can't talk about any of it because most of it was trying to be 5 to 10 years out. So we'll wait and see. But again, it's ultimately about creating your own story around these things. And so increasingly, I find myself as now a freelancer looking at a lot at prototyping. I was getting really into this space as well of the sort of physicality and how things go together. So this was about my journey with prototyping prosthetics. And it started as this was the third project I did, fourth actually, but with BBC Two's Big Life Fix. And this was an incredible privilege working with a huge range of incredible designers, engineers, user experience designers. It was just absolutely wonderful. And I would strongly recommend it. So as you can see, this is a YouTube video. I'm not going to play it here for copyright reasons because the video is owned by BBC Stories, but there's a link below. So please have a click on it, pause this, and come back when you're done. So hopefully that's all good. And I wanted to, obviously TV is always edited in a very, they're saving the juiciest cuts. And I think that's incredibly important when you're trying to engage a wider audience. And I love the fact that Kyle's story, the way that it's put together is incredibly powerful, and I think it's just a joy to see that video every time. But I kind of feel also that because this video and indeed the presentation in Bangor was for a design audience, I really wanted to show the behind the scenes and, a little bit the warts and all. And so this is my, chaotic table that was a mixture of, as you can see, having to diary cam my stuff for the documentary whilst modeling things on a pretty limited space. So it's only many years later that I actually now have a little shed. But for all of that series, I was working on a kitchen table or living room table. So, the truth really is that you don't have to have big fancy workshops to get stuff done. So the challenge was really that it was, considered impossible to help Kyle. It was just considered this isn't going to happen. And I was always remembered by, a phrase by, a good friend and a really impressive mentor of mine, Eric Hansen at Lego, who in moments like that used to just say, we begin by beginning. And I really felt that was actually something I was doing in Big Life Fix, but tried to do more of since working with great people like that. So this was sort of my sketchbooks, and again, I could have spent time doing the sort of flashy sketches with all the pro markers and all that sort of stuff. But again, I kind of wanted the honesty that this is me taking notes whilst Yvonne was telling me how to cut hair for the first time, and this was me literally learning how to cut hair on the fly in about an hour and a half tutorial with a mannequin. And then having to take notes on how Kyle was doing, both from discussions with him, but also observations, which are maybe the things which, the subtleties that then inform your later design decisions. So trust the process, and I think really try to worry less about solving it and just being a sponge for the information. So again, there was this little note that I put, which actually became critical, and I didn't realize it, which was 80% of a hedge cutting is done with these 3 cuts. So these 3 types of cut were critical. And again, a subtlety that, straight cutting is important, but then this stab cut, which is sort of feathered cut, is actually critical. And what it meant was that we couldn't just shortcut this and lash a sort of beard trimmer to Kyle's arm and get it done, because you could never do this second cut with that effectively. So it had to be with scissors. So I'd say this page was actually sort of pretty much set the tone of the entire project, which is how do we nail these 3 cuts, and we can't use a mechanical device because it isn't going to work. So finding the experts, I think, is something that, it's always tempting to think, oh, I can just do this alone. And I think what's great about Big Life Fix is that even from the offset, you never believe you can do this alone. It's incredibly complicated. So I spent a lot of time going through the history, you can see here on the left, of all manner of different prosthetic devices and how people have, done everything from butter toast to brush their teeth over the years. We can get into a huge debate, and I have other interviews with people like Nigel Ackland, who, about where do you go between having something that looks, should we say, robotic or bionic, the sort of emotional choice between that or having something which is trying to pass itself off as being more human. And I don't say this as someone who is able to empathize with this at all, not suffering any such disability, but I can appreciate it's a highly individual choice, and it's very nuanced and very personal, and there is no one size fits all. And so as much of this project was not about people with prosthetics, this was about what Kyle as an individual wanted. And I think that is always the last percentage, which is incredibly hard for an organization like an NHS to say, look, we're delivering 99% of the thing, which is great, but of course we're always going to miss that small percentage, which is down to the individual. But I think that's where support, friends, family, and voluntary organizations like Remap can help. And I think that's where it was great to step in at that 1% of trying to tune something up for the individual. So anyway, this was working with the professionals, and at that point I was sort of showing a little bit the idea that I'd had with these 2 combs, and looking at sort of what parts of Kyle's hand we could and couldn't interact with, and so trying to be very, very conscious that I did not at any point ever want to do something that looked fun or cool, but actually was doing harm in some ways to Kyle's hand, either instantly and it was causing him pain, or something that I was unaware of because I'm not a professional, that actually if he did that for 5 years, it would create irreparable damage, maybe to nerves or tendons or muscles or tissue. And so I really wanted the blessing of the experts to say what I was doing was ethically and technically sound. So I couldn't stress that enough. If you're doing something where you don't know what you're doing, make sure you have people who are backing you up. And I would say even increasingly as you get further into your career, there's inevitably a risk that you will do something that does have, regrettably a mistake. But if you've done due process to show that you did everything humanly possible to avoid harm, that is always going to be a better position, not just from a legal, and sort of getting sued stand, but honestly as a sort of being able to live with yourself. I feel that Kyle, has so far, touch wood, been in good shape with this device. But I honestly believe that we went through such lengths to make sure that we were taking care of him and that he was the priority above everything else. And I think that's the only way you can really go as a designer. So anyway, another little story that I loved were from the team of Sarah and Ariane, was basically saying that, it's interesting. There's all these really fancy, super intricate robotics here. And then there's this little thing from Poundland, which is a thing where you pull this yellow trigger and it closes the hand just like that. It doesn't do anything particularly nuanced, and it certainly doesn't do that motion for cutting hair. But they were making the point that this is a lot of bangs for the buck, if you know what I mean. This is getting a lot done. So they were really advocates of doing it simply as possible. So I think an advice here would just be like, prototype something, even if you hate it at first. Just get going, because it will create a discussion. And sometimes even having the slight, it's a little bit like comedy duos, having someone who pretends to be the straight guy and someone who's the funny guy. I think actually if you walk in as a big deal designer, you kind of intimidate. And also, certainly at the beginning of your career, it's just not the case. And I think actually having a few humble mistakes can actually really endear the person to you. And I think it's tempting to think, oh, but I've got to look flawless. And no, of course you've not. You've got to look compassionate and empathetic. And actually that's a really good place to start from. So Kyle taking the mick out of some of my first attempts was actually a great way to begin not just the design process, but also the relationship, which I loved having with Kyle. So that was terrific. And again, just working through all these little sketches and ideas. And this was, if you like, the breakthrough moment as implied on the video, where I sort of realized that the beard clippers, as they cut and when they run out of battery, they tend to pinch your beard. And I thought, what happens if I deliberately do that, but with combs, so that they could slide through when they're like that and then close them partially, so that they then lock the hair in place and would enable Kyle to cut and then release them again so that the hair would flow through. And that was essentially the basis of it. And that was just prototyping with Poundland combs. And again, even though I've done the CAD, of course I'm an engineer, I wanted to stress that this is not the time to do sort of fancy stuff. This is really the time to nail the user interaction first and foremost. So documenting the process, I think, is also key, just because even the stuff when it's going wrong, as in this case, makes for some good stories when you're getting it wrong. So this was sort of, if you like, laying down all the prototypes, so the breakthrough Poundland comb. When I got the principle to work with the mannequin, I was looking at solenoids to basically actuate the combs. Wasn't really a good idea. Even, little bits of Lego, linear actuators. I was looking at ABS versus carbon inside PLA 3D prints. I was looking at the orientation in which you print it, locking mechanisms from little switches, all different switches to mechanize it. And then the human factor and the ergonomics. For example, this little paper clip, that was born out of Kyle just going, yeah, I need a little handle on it to push it. It's too fiddly if it doesn't have a handle. So little things like that. And actually that became a sort of embellishment that working with Mark, the jewelry maker, to sort of take that to a little bit more of a flourish. So again, scribbling all these out, the failures are kind of fun. And indeed, if you're making a documentary, the jeopardy is always something the directors love. So good hero shots are nice, but this wasn't really what I was about. It doesn't save an idea that doesn't actually work. And I think it wasn't just sort of like a great bit of relief that when Kyle liked it, but it was also kind of cool that the other hairdressers in Kyle's training course who did have full use of their hands were actually going, "Yeah, that's pretty cool actually, can I get one?" And even though it was a lot of just joking around, it was nice that they actually even thought, but that's quite clever. It's nice. I actually quite like it. So I think working with things like that, always quite exciting. So anyway, yeah, going through the thing of course it being a TV show, we're able to do, spend a little bit of money on getting some really nice 3D prints so that I could work with a model and a mock-up of Kyle's hand. But again, it's funny how much, the technology. I look back at this presentation and it's less than a year old, and already, even though we used a really really high quality scanner to get Kyle's hand scanned, you can actually get stuff that's pretty good that works on your phone now. And you basically just print out a piece of paper with a checkerboard and you scan around it. And I think it's called Clone, spelt with a Q. So crazy to think that even in that short space of time, there's so many ways that you can sort of like crack a nut with technology as a student for almost no money, or indeed free in this case. So I think as well, when you're looking at prospective employers, they care more about the process, even if the end result is just, good. It's really about the process. Did you go through those iterations? Were you critical? Did you test it? Did you take the setbacks? And so again, this is sort of breaking down the complexity and the things that really needed refinement. And I think it's not just speaking to the engineering side of things, it's also the aesthetic. We were really refining the aesthetic decisions as we went. So collaborating, as I said, what was great was that this video here of again, I'll put a link in the bottom of Kyle just learning how to actuate the comb and make sense of it, and you can see it's just stuck on with blue tack here, and it really informs that when I went to Mark, the jewelry expert, it was just one of those things where it was incredible that he added such a wonderful layer of finish to it. But actually, I was kind of proud of the fact that there was nothing where he was looking at it going, yeah, but this is nonsense. It doesn't make sense. So the engineering, should we say, chassis was sound, and we were putting then the body on it a little bit like a car. So I think the fact that I'd also made these tools so that they were a bit like Swiss Army knife, they were interchangeable, I was also really proud of that fact as well. So again, that thing of, I think a key insight is that you're not a chef in a kitchen who brings something to your table under this sort of great, sort of anticipation. Design isn't like that. It's a two-way process that starts as early as possible. So what I loved about this project wasn't me going, here you go, Carl, hope you like it. We were working on it together continuously. And I think actually one of the biggest journeys wasn't just the design process. It was Kyle moving from thinking, should I or could I have a bionic hand, and we realizing after speaking to everyone that no bionic hand is even close to being able to manipulate hair. And so what we're really looking at is a bespoke tool. And so Kyle had to depart from a choice of bionic hands doing something which is technologically extremely difficult to a tool which, because it's dedicated, can actually do just that one thing well. So of course, the thing that we made can't cut up dinner. We had to sort of park that and say that's for a different solution. But if you're doing 8 hours in the hairdresser as part of your job, this is the best tool for the job. And that was the conclusion that we ultimately came to in parallel with all the design work. So I think as well, it's fair to say we took chances together. And I think I love this picture that we had sort of finished, and we were just playing around with some of the refinements. And as I said, this was a myoband looking at signals, taking the muscle electricity signals that are in your arm naturally and converting it into a bionic arm. And again, we tested it. It's interesting. It's super cool, but it's just not nuanced enough for a hairdresser. So strangely, this little thing was actually the sort of guiding star of keeping it as simple as possible and treating it more like a tool. So I think, again, sharing your story, I'll put a link in below, but I also showed the sort of detailed step-by-step of how I did this at a great website called instructables.com, and I'll put a link below, and hope that is also useful. So I want to talk a little bit about prototyping your career and a brief Folio recap. So this is in the previous one in 2008, but I covered this with students of basically saying you could start off with a cover page, content, create some sort of big impact, process which then breaks down into problem, bit of jeopardy, and a win. But then it's really about extracting that into having a real problem, design, build, and test, stressing real life. And if it isn't good, then iterating it and going back through that process. And only when the user loves it do you go for the CAD. Those big hero shots for your degree show, but you have to be confident that the user truly loves it. You're not just, tarting it up. So then once you've done your big process, I think it's reasonable to say that you've got implied depth in things that are other projects that you're maybe showing less of, but of course you can bring more back up into the interview. So showing things that are a bit quirky, a bit ambitious, and a bit intriguing, maybe even a cliffhanger, or indeed voluntary things that are just, seemingly disconnected, but are still part of your ethos and outlook. And I think those can be great icebreakers for a recruiter or indeed the people you're working with. But keeping that to around maximum of 10 slides. So, feedback that I had from doing a masterclass with students, which was about 12 students. I was, going through their folio and taking an in-depth look. And I think this feels consistent that even with a year between the two, actually less emphasis on hero shots, appreciating that the text is going to be skimmed through in 2 minutes, and keeping the pages tight. I think more process documentation was a theme that not just myself, but even just talking through with other people presenting at the conference, who are in companies, that seemed pretty consistent. Human factors and consumer experience. It was very much about the quality, not the quantity of work, which I appreciate is very glib and easy to say, but it's just saying select the things where you think that is really memorable and remarkable. If you've got a really fun bit where the story twisted and you realise something that was critical, that's the bit that needs to be in your folio. So next steps, I was advising students to do a bit more mini projects, do stuff that doesn't always have the big overbearing pressure of a formal course, and find tough problems. Genuinely, as I said, the final year, being completely out of your depth, losing yourself, going for the risks, but sort of being responsible that you think, I've still got enough time to bring this to a conclusion. That's the best way to sort of try and live your final year if you possibly can. And that your employer wants to see the risks more than you maybe believe. As much as companies are indeed about certainty in delivering, that's important, but they want to see that you can take a calculated risk and still finalize it, not just take a safe project and it looks inevitable from day one. I really don't believe that's going to get anyone the job. So keep it real, interesting problems, keep it simple as you possibly can. I know it's easier said than done, but keep it about people and good stories. So feedback on the comments. What I did here, this is obviously a little bit different than YouTube, but in 2008 I asked people to give comments, and this was from an undergraduate design course, and said, don't pull any punches, tell me what you really want, what you really need to know here. And so I had things these were obviously anonymous, and so to be honest, these felt exactly the same as when I was in their shoes, and some of them I still do. Worried about not being good enough for a job, becoming stagnant, too comfortable. And so what I did was basically go through these, and I appreciate I don't have time to sort of give an hour on each of these subjects, but because I've had to battle through some of these things myself, I tried to actually put a reference or a source as a minimum to say, go jump into this, maybe it'll help. So, if I go through these, you can either skip through these where I gave some books, or I'll go through it. But essentially, people being worried about not good enough for a job, I felt that it was useful to point out that most jobs will accept a candidate that can do 60% of the task, but has the right attitude to learn and try. And I really this is very awkward because I don't want the comments to go crazy with something taken out of context. But I say this having, employed 50-50 gender equality myself, so I care massively about it. But I do think I noticed that guys tend to have a little bit more swagger and arrogance, which can be a problem, I might stress. But if I was going to create a sweeping generalization, so please forgive me, but I think sometimes, young women can lack confidence and they really think they've got to do the 80, 90, 100% of the job before they even try to apply. And I hope that this becomes incredibly outdated and I look ridiculous saying it, but I really felt from having candid, honest discussions with some of the students and indeed the tutors who've seen many students go through their doors, I got to say that as a supportive comment, and I mean it with all sincerity. Just definitely recalibrate that thing. The world needs more female influence in so many decisions. You only have to look at Silicon Valley to see things derailed terribly through a lack of equality and diversity. And it's not just for the sake of it, but I think the change has to happen. Anyway, moving on. Becoming stagnant, too comfortable, or paralyzed. Excuse me. So I think keep looking for small projects, either for people, for example, Remap company I mentioned, or for yourself, just going on Instructables and just getting feedback from people thinking it's good or could be done differently. I still think is really powerful. So introductions are scary. I think ask your network. As much as it feels like nepotism, it's the best nepotism that you can take advantage of. If you know that someone in your university just got a job at a great company, it's crazy not to ask them. I definitely got good jobs because of people I knew, not just because of what I knew. It really is true. And so I wouldn't have got into spec design without, some really nice people just being like, here's a student, forward it to them. They didn't say anything, but even just that forwarding of an email and a folio makes a huge difference. I'm pretty certain. So I think, it's really about just saying go for it. The worst thing you can do is just ask for a quick phone call and get some honest feedback on your folio. So my skills are not relevant or transferable. I think, I put join the club. Skills are always moving forward. If you can't learn it, know someone who can do it. I'm certainly not virtuoso at coding or any of these sorts of things with electronics, but I seem to find myself working on a lot of projects that have that, but I'm working with someone who's able to help me out. And likewise, I'd like to think that I help them out on some of the physical prototyping stuff, which I do a little bit to a reasonable level. So being broke, it's I think I was reading Paul Bettany recently that I think it's one of those things where like being broke is fine. Being broke passes. It's a financial situation and financial problem, and I would say in many ways sort of don't be proud to sort of hustle and find money. I applied, when I was at uni for hardship grants. Didn't come from a millionaire family. There are support networks. Enter awards. Try and get those little bits of cash. I think it's one of those things like the more you can hustle to try and get it, don't have any shame in just being real about the truth. And I did when I'd finished university. It took me a long time to figure out what I was going to do. I did sign on. I worked in building sites, just to make ends meet, and because I had to. So I'd really say sort of, even call centers, it's still a good experience of having that hustle. So essentially, yeah, don't be too proud to ask or do a job to make it happen. So Brexit, man, assuming it even happens, you still have about 5 years until you have to go. So I think, obviously this was sort of, more pressure for people who were immigrants in the UK, but I think there's still, this video will date, but I'm hoping that there's a sunset period that still gives people a lot of opportunity. And I say this with friends and family who have been immigrants and some who have got citizenship. definitely trying to find a good employer, put the time in now. It can be the reason your visa can then turn to citizenships. So, can I sustain motivation? It's a tough question. But I think making a calendar helps. I think setting small, achievable goals, and I think sometimes even setting fake goals. I'm even doing this video out of a slight gun to a head because I told a friend I would by next week, and I kind of think sometimes just even throwing down that gauntlet to yourself can help. Applying for a job, failing, then being demotivated. It doesn't really get that much easier other than you just learn to sort of you've experienced that you've come through the other side. But I don't think anyone really loves rejection. um, and I think, sort of just my advice was probably sort of avoiding the sort of cold applications. Just, cut and paste applications. It's demoralizing when you think, I've done 10 applications, no one replied back. Better to use that time to do two really, really well. I think when I was applying for Lego, I applied to Lego and one other company, and I just went all in on both companies. Um, the other one was in sustainability and electric vehicle design. So again, you still never know when that might come back into my life. So I still think it's better to be passionate about something than meh and do 10 of them. So worried about competition? Yep. If you're not the best, you can still be first, more generous, more friendly, more interested in the subject, and more willing, or even, I mentioned it last, but you could just be cheaper. So again, try and see what you have that differentiates you. I know that with a friend of mine, we ended up doing a uh, call center association best in practice trophy design, and we didn't even get paid for it, and it was also terrible what we did because we didn't know how to really produce a trophy on batch production, so we didn't get the gig. But and also, like, it's the least sexy thing in the world to be like call center association, looking back. But I still really admired the fact they gave us a go, they humoured us, they let us apply. We weren't good enough at all, even for a call center association. So just sometimes it's better to have had that experience and you can laugh about it than, have everything hinging on when you graduate. Do stuff in the summers when you're still an undergraduate. Uh, Lack confidence in your own work. I don't think that ever goes. I think I still doubt everything I do, to varying degrees. I think, and I feel that's the same with every sort of designer I really spoke to over a beer or something. Everyone has those doubts. Start with what you've enjoyed and are proud of. Critique isn't everything. Be excited about doing better next time. I think it's reasonable to sort of say, it's funny, I'm sitting here with two cardboard dinosaur heads I made for my son. This was the first one, and the teeth just aren't really good. Whereas the teeth, I realised if I cut them out from the same piece, they align better and look a bit better. It's an imperceptible difference, but for some reason, I kind of still saw it as progress. And if I can still be happy about making a better dinosaur mask for my kid, then you still have to extend that passion into your professional work at some point. It isn't always the big sexy headlines, it is the granular detail. My skills are not yet professional enough. You're unlikely to be better than a pro when you start, but you are cheap, willing, open-minded, and not jaded. And that's really valued by a lot of companies. It's one of the least fun things ever, having someone who is jaded and unwilling to try. And I think don't overestimate passion. Is energizing to a good design team. Won't get to use skills I've learned. Use them in your hobbies, for friends, and if possible for small jobs or pro bono. Just use them anyway. That was why I did ceramics. No one was paying me. I just loved it. I loved the fact it really was a combination of materials science, art, and form and function. Everything was coming together for me, and I think even though I didn't make a career out of it, I love the fact that it kept certain things alive. It's rare that you ever get a job that satisfies every single thing you do, or even if you do go independent, you still got to do all the other boring stuff like the tax returns and the accountants and the finance and the fundraising or whatever that isn't design. And so I think it's always a mix, but try and enjoy it anyway. So yeah, I thought I'd break it down quickly to three things which I almost had like more votes, and I thought some good books to suggest were Not Being Good Enough. This has really helped me. James Reed's Why You, and it's going to look cheesy saying it, but I kind of feel like there's some honesty in saying, yeah, read the classics. How to win friends and influence people. I was terrible at networking, and I still feel it's something that I have to work at and I have to mentally switch on. I think it kind of actually irritates me that there's this supposed introvert and extrovert thing. I'm appearing extrovert because I'm making a YouTube video confidently, or at least it's not stressing me out particularly. But that's because I've been doing this for like over 10 years, and there really isn't a shortcut. But I can tell you that the first ones I did were terrifying, and I made hordes of mistakes, and that's just how it is. And introductions are scary. I think Thomas Heatherwick was a big influence on me, still is. And he's got a great book on making, of just how to basically get going with ideas. So ideas, but also introducing yourself to people as well. So again, I'll hopefully you can sort of like take a look at these. So this is like Stefan Sagmeister's Made You Look, Seth Godin's All Weird, Fear of Fun, Ralph Kostler. This was a really interesting one that I've forgotten the name of and can't read. But anyway, I'll post a link in the bottom. Understanding Comics, Scott McCloud, Ray Dalio's Principles, Simon Sinek's Start With Why. This was The Art of Looking Sideways. This was It's Not How Good You Are, It's How Good You Want to Be. I'd take it with a pinch of salt, but there's some funny things in there that are memorable. The Inevitable, Kevin Kelly, Predatory Thinking, Shoe Dog, Phil Knight, Design for the Real World, Victor Papanek. Man, I have a lot of questions about how do I get in sustainable design at the minute. Really, just read this book. It isn't going to give you all the answers, but it will help you form the right questions about what you're doing. This book feels like it just never really goes out of date. It just is as real, and honest as it ever could be. I love this book by Ed Catmull, Creativity Inc. And business model generation. If you're getting into that sort of thing, this is really helpful as a sort of workbook. I think if you've got a lot of insecurities, this book really amused me. Designers are wankers. Homo Deus, I think, was just a great expansion of looking at things differently. If you can't sketch, this was really good. Sketch Notes, and also, as I mentioned, Brendan Dawes in previous talk, Analog In, Digital Out, and of course there's loads of books on prototyping. Mastery by Robert Greene is also really good, and The Hard Thing About Hard Things if you're doing startups. So I hope those are some interesting books that could get you going on particular things. And so yeah, I hope that's physical prototyping in design and in life. Thanks very much. Please put some comments in below, and hope that was useful. Thanks again. Bye.